The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the marble floors of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel's main dining room. Alexander Hartwell adjusted his platinum cufflinks and surveyed the opulent scene before him with the practiced indifference of someone who had grown up surrounded by such luxury. At 32, he commanded a business empire worth over $8 billion. Yet tonight felt like just another tedious evening of networking and artificial smiles. The charity gala buzzed with the usual crowd of Manhattan's elite. Women in designer gowns worth more than most people's annual salaries glided between tables, their jewelry catching the light like trapped stars. Men in custom-tailored tuxedos discussed market fluctuations and yacht purchases with the same casual tone others might use to talk about the weather. Alexander had attended hundreds of such events, each one blending into the next in a haze of champagne toasts and empty conversations. "Alex, darling, you simply must meet my niece Caroline," chirped Mrs. Pemberton, a society matron whose husband owned half of Manhattan's real estate. She practically dragged a young woman in a flowing emerald gown toward Alexander's table. "She's just graduated from Juilliard with the most wonderful voice." Caroline extended a perfectly manicured hand, her smile as polished as her appearance. "Mr. Hartwell, it's such an honor. I've heard so much about your philanthropic work with the arts." Alexander shook her hand briefly, noting the calculated warmth in her eyes. Another debutante hoping to snare a wealthy husband. He had encountered dozens like her over the years, each one armed with the same arsenal of charm, beauty, and carefully crafted accomplishments. "The pleasure is mine, Miss Vanderbilt. Caroline Vanderbilt. I was wondering if you might be interested in hearing me perform sometime. I specialize in classical pieces, particularly Mozart." The mention of Mozart sparked something in Alexander's memory. His late grandmother, the only person who had ever truly understood him, had been a passionate lover of classical music. She had often played Mozart's compositions on her antique piano, filling their family estate with melodies that seemed to reach into his very soul. After her death 5 years ago, he had avoided classical music entirely, finding it too painful to bear the memories it evoked. "Mozart, you say?" Alexander's tone carried a hint of skepticism. He had heard countless society ladies claim to be accomplished singers, only to discover their talents were more about connections than actual ability. "How fascinating. Tell me, what's your favorite piece?" Caroline launched into a detailed description of various Mozart arias, her words flowing with the rehearsed precision of someone who had given this speech many times before. Alexander listened politely, but his attention wandered to the bustling activity around the dining room's edges, where the hotel staff moved with quiet efficiency. Near the kitchen entrance, a young woman in the standard black and white server uniform caught his eye. Unlike the other waitstaff who seemed focused solely on their tasks, this woman moved with an unusual grace, as if she were dancing rather than simply carrying trays. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and even from across the room, Alexander could see that she possessed a natural elegance that no amount of money could buy. "And that's why I believe Mozart's work speaks to the eternal human condition," Caroline concluded, clearly expecting some response to her monologue. "Fascinating," Alexander replied absently, still watching the mysterious waitress. "You know, Caroline, anyone can claim to appreciate Mozart. But true musical talent? That's quite rare these days." His voice carried across the table, loud enough for several nearby guests to overhear. Mrs. Pemberton leaned in closer, sensing gossip in the making. "Whatever do you mean, Alexander?" A mischievous impulse seized him, born perhaps from years of tedium and artificial encounters. "Well, take Mozart, for instance. His compositions require not just technical skill, but genuine emotional depth. I'd wager that most people who claim to love classical music couldn't actually perform it with any real feeling." He paused dramatically, enjoying the shocked expressions around the table. "In fact, I'm so confident about this that I'll make a rather bold statement." The conversation at neighboring tables began to quiet as word spread that Alexander Hartwell was about to say something interesting. Caroline's eyes widened with anticipation, clearly hoping this was leading to some sort of romantic gesture. Alexander stood up slowly, his commanding presence drawing even more attention. The room gradually fell silent as people strained to hear what the billionaire would say next. He had a reputation for being unpredictable, and his pronouncements often became the subject of society gossip for weeks. "I hereby declare," Alexander announced, his voice carrying clearly across the dining room, "that if anyone in this room can sing a Mozart aria with true passion and skill, not just technical competence, but real emotional depth, I'll marry them on the spot." Gasps and nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Some guests assumed he was joking, while others wondered if the pressure of his business empire had finally affected his sanity. Caroline's face flushed crimson, torn between embarrassment and the tantalizing possibility that this might be her moment of triumph. "Alexander, really?" Mrs. Pemberton tittered nervously. "You can't be serious." "Oh, but I am," Alexander replied, settling back into his chair with obvious amusement. "After all, what's the point of having billions of dollars if you can't make life interesting? Consider it a challenge to all you cultured, accomplished ladies and gentlemen. Show me someone who can truly bring Mozart to life, and I'll show you someone worth marrying." The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle clink of silverware against china and the distant sounds of the kitchen. Caroline opened her mouth as if to accept the challenge, then seemed to think better of it, perhaps realizing that failure in such a public forum would be devastating to her social standing. From across the room, the dark-haired waitress Alexander had noticed earlier was refilling water glasses at a table near the windows. She had paused in her work, a crystal pitcher suspended in her hand as she listened to his pronouncement. For a moment, their eyes met across the crowded room, and Alexander was struck by the intensity of her gaze. There was something in her expression, a flicker of emotion he couldn't quite identify, before she quickly looked away and resumed her duties. "Well," said Mrs. Pemberton, desperate to break the awkward silence, "I'm sure Caroline would be delighted to demonstrate her talents. Wouldn't you, dear?" Caroline's confidence seemed to have evaporated. "Perhaps this isn't the right venue for such a performance. The acoustics here aren't ideal for classical vocals." Alexander nodded thoughtfully, though his eyes continued to track the movement of the mysterious waitress. "Of course. How convenient. It seems my challenge will go unanswered after all." The conversation gradually resumed around the table, but with a forced quality that suggested everyone was still processing what had just occurred. Alexander's bold declaration would undoubtedly be the talk of Manhattan's social circles by morning, analyzed and dissected by gossip columnists and society bloggers alike. As the evening wore on, Alexander found himself increasingly distracted by the efficient grace of the serving staff, particularly the dark-haired woman who had caught his attention earlier. She seemed to anticipate the guests' needs before they even realized them themselves, refilling wine glasses just as they emptied and clearing plates with impeccable timing. Yet there was something in her bearing that suggested she was observing everything around her with the sharp intelligence of someone who understood far more than her position might indicate. During the main course, a pompous art dealer named Reginald Ashworth began holding forth on the declining state of classical music education. "Young people today simply don't appreciate the finer things," he declared, gesturing wildly with his fork. "They're too busy with their electronic noise to understand the sublime beauty of true artistry." "I quite agree," chimed in a woman whose neck was adorned with what appeared to be half the diamonds in Manhattan. "Classical music requires a certain level of sophistication that seems to be disappearing from society." Alexander listened to this familiar refrain with growing irritation. These people spoke about art and culture as if they were exclusive commodities, available only to those with the proper pedigree and bank account. His grandmother, despite her wealth, had never displayed such arrogance about music. For her, Mozart and Bach and Beethoven were not status symbols, but sources of genuine joy and transcendence. "Tell me, Reginald," Alexander interjected, "when was the last time you actually listened to classical music? Not at a social event like this, but really listened, with your full attention?" Reginald blustered, clearly caught off guard by the directness of the question. "Well, that is to say, I attended the opera just last month." "To be seen, or to hear the music?" The uncomfortable silence that followed provided its own answer. Alexander's challenging question had exposed the hollow nature of much of the cultural posturing that went on in their social circle. People attended the opera, the symphony, and gallery openings not out of genuine appreciation for art, but because it was expected of them, part of the elaborate performance of wealth and sophistication. As if summoned by the conversation, the dark-haired waitress appeared at Alexander's elbow to refill his wine glass. Her movement was so smooth and unobtrusive that most of the table's occupants didn't even notice her presence. But Alexander caught a subtle change in her expression as she listened to the discussion, a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she had strong opinions about what she was hearing. "Excuse me," Alexander said quietly, causing her to pause in her task. "I don't believe we've been introduced." She looked up, meeting his gaze with surprising directness. "I'm just serving staff, sir. We don't typically introduce ourselves to guests." Her voice was soft but clear, with a slight accent that Alexander couldn't immediately place. There was also something musical about her tone, a natural rhythm that made even her simple response sound almost melodic. "Everyone deserves to be acknowledged," Alexander replied. "What's your name?" She hesitated for a moment, glancing around as if checking whether any of her supervisors were watching. "Elena, sir. Elena Rodriguez." "Elena." He repeated her name, enjoying the way it rolled off his tongue. "That's a beautiful name." "Spanish. My grandmother was from Barcelona," Elena confirmed, her professional composure never wavering despite the unusual nature of the conversation. Mrs. Pemberton was watching this exchange with growing disapproval. "Alexander, dear, I'm sure the young lady has other tables to attend to." Elena immediately stepped back, recognizing the dismissal for what it was. But Alexander wasn't ready to end the conversation. "Elena, I'm curious about your opinion on something. Do you think classical music is only for the educated elite?" The question clearly surprised her. She glanced around the table, taking in the expectant faces of the wealthy diners, most of whom seemed annoyed by this disruption to their evening's entertainment. "I think music belongs to everyone, sir," she said carefully. "Beautiful music speaks to the heart, not the wallet." Her words carried a quiet conviction that made several of the guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. Here was a waitress, presumably from a working-class background, expressing a more genuine understanding of art than most of the supposed cultural sophisticates surrounding Alexander's table. "Wise words," Alexander said, genuinely impressed. "Do you have a musical background yourself?" Elena's composure flickered for just a moment, and Alexander caught 3 days after the charity gala. Alexander found himself unable to concentrate on quarterly reports or board meetings. His usually sharp business mind kept wandering to thoughts of dark eyes and a musical voice that had spoken of music belonging to everyone. The memory of Elena Rodriguez haunted him with an intensity that surprised him, particularly since their interaction had lasted only a few minutes. His personal assistant, Margaret, noticed his distraction during their morning briefing. She had worked for Alexander for nearly 8 years and prided herself on anticipating his needs before he voiced them. Today, however, he seemed completely disconnected from the usual rhythm of their routine. "Mr. Hartwell, the Henderson acquisition documents need your signature, and the board meeting for the Peterson Foundation has been moved to Thursday," Margaret said, studying his distant expression with concern. "Sir, are you feeling well?" Alexander blinked, refocusing on the present moment. "Fine, Margaret. Just thinking through some strategic decisions." He paused, then made what seemed like an impulsive choice. "Cancel my lunch meeting with Davidson. I want to visit the Grand Metropolitan Hotel instead." Margaret raised an eyebrow, but made a note in her tablet. "Shall I make a reservation for lunch in their restaurant?" "No. I want to speak with their Human Resources Department about their service staff. Specifically, I need information about one of their waitresses." This request was so unusual that Margaret actually stopped typing and looked up at him directly. "Sir, is there some kind of service issue I should be aware of? Did something happen at the gala?" "Nothing like that. I simply want to follow up on something." Alexander realized how strange his request must sound, but he couldn't bring himself to explain his growing fascination with a woman whose last name he barely knew. "Just arrange a meeting with whoever manages their service personnel." 2 hours later, Alexander found himself in the tastefully appointed office of Mrs. Patricia Carlyle, the Grand Metropolitan's Director of Human Resources. She was a crisp, professional woman in her 50s who clearly took pride in the hotel's reputation for excellence. "Mr. Hartwell, it's such an honor to meet you," Mrs. Carlyle said, gesturing for him to take a seat in one of the leather chairs facing her desk. "I understand you have some questions about our staff?" "Yes. I was impressed by the quality of service at Monday's gala, particularly from one of your waitresses, Elena Rodriguez. I'd like to learn more about her background." Mrs. Carlyle's expression became cautious. "Mr. Hartwell, I hope you understand that we have strict policies about employee privacy. I can't share personal information about our staff members without their consent. Of course, I'm not asking for anything inappropriate. I'm simply curious about her qualifications. She struck me as exceptionally talented, and I might have some opportunities that could benefit someone with her skills." This explanation seemed to ease Mrs. Carlyle's concerns slightly. "Elena is indeed one of our most valued employees. She's been with us for about 2 years now, ever since she moved to New York. Extremely reliable, speaks 3 languages fluently, and has an unusual ability to connect with our most demanding guests." "Where did she move from?" "I believe she relocated from somewhere in the Midwest. Chicago, perhaps. She's been quite private about her background, but her references were impeccable. She actually holds a degree from Northwestern University, which is somewhat unusual for someone in her position." This information intrigued Alexander even more. A university graduate working as a waitress suggested either desperate circumstances or someone hiding from something in their past. What field was her degree in? Mrs. Carlyle consulted her computer screen. "Music education, with a minor in performance." "Quite impressive, actually." She mentioned during her interview that she hoped to eventually find work in her field, but she needed immediate employment when she arrived in the city. Alexander felt his pulse quicken. A music degree, specifically in education and performance. This explained the subtle musicality he had detected in her voice, and possibly much more. "Is she working today?" "I believe she's scheduled for the afternoon shift." "Mr. Hartwell, if you don't mind my asking, what kind of opportunities were you considering? I'd hate for us to lose such a valuable employee, but if there's something that would benefit her career." "Nothing concrete yet. I'm exploring options for a cultural foundation I'm establishing. We'll need people with both educational background and real-world experience." It wasn't entirely untrue. Alexander had been considering various philanthropic ventures, though none had progressed beyond the conceptual stage. After leaving Mrs. Carlyle's office, Alexander found himself walking through the hotel's elegant lobby with no particular destination in mind. The afternoon crowd was lighter than during evening events, mostly business travelers and tourists checking in or out. He felt somewhat foolish, wandering around a hotel hoping to catch a glimpse of a waitress whose story had captured his imagination. He settled into one of the lobby's plush armchairs with a newspaper, positioning himself where he could observe the restaurant entrance. It felt ridiculous, like some kind of amateur surveillance operation, but he couldn't seem to help himself. The rational part of his mind kept insisting this was a waste of time, that he was romanticizing a brief encounter with someone who was probably nothing like the intriguing figure he had built up in his imagination. After nearly an hour of pretending to read the same article about international trade negotiations, Alexander was about to abandon his vigil when Elena emerged from the restaurant wearing her standard black and white uniform. She moved with the same graceful efficiency he remembered from the gala, but today he noticed something different in her expression. She looked tired, not physically but emotionally, as if she were carrying some invisible burden. She walked directly toward the hotel's employee entrance, passing within 20 feet of where Alexander sat. On impulse, he stood up and intercepted her path. "Elena." She stopped abruptly, surprise flashing across her features before settling into polite professionalism. "Mr. Hartwell, what brings you back to the hotel?" "Business meeting," he said, which was technically accurate. "I was hoping I might run into you, actually. I wanted to apologize for the other night. My dinner companions weren't very welcoming, and I should have handled that better." Elena's expression softened slightly. "That's very kind of you, but completely unnecessary. I'm used to, well, let's just say I understand how these events work." There was something in her tone that suggested deeper experience with the dismissive attitudes of wealthy society, but Alexander didn't want to push too hard for details. I also wanted to thank you for your comment about music belonging to everyone. It was the most genuine thing anyone said all evening. A small smile played at the corners of Elena's mouth. I probably shouldn't have said anything. Mrs. Carlyle is always reminding us to keep our opinions to ourselves around guests. Sometimes the most important truths come from unexpected sources. Alexander paused, wrestling with how to continue the conversation without seeming inappropriate or pushy. I understand you have a background in music education. Elena's pleasant expression immediately became guarded. How do you know that? I spoke with Mrs. Carlyle earlier. I was curious about your qualifications. I'm involved with several educational initiatives, and I'm always looking for talented people. Mr. Hartwell, I appreciate whatever you think you're trying to do, but I'm not looking for charity. I have a job, and I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. Her response carried a pride that Alexander found both admirable and frustrating. This isn't charity. I'm talking about legitimate opportunities for someone with your background and skills. Elena studied his face for a moment, as if trying to determine his true motivations. Can I ask you something directly? Of course. Why are you really here? You're one of the wealthiest men in the country. You could have any kind of cultural foundation you wanted, staffed by people with impressive credentials and extensive connections. Why are you talking to a waitress in a hotel lobby? Her directness caught Alexander off guard. Most people in his world dealt with him through layers of politeness and calculated deference. Elena's willingness to challenge his motives was both refreshing and slightly intimidating. Because impressive credentials and extensive connections don't always translate to genuine passion or understanding, he said finally. I've spent most of my adult life surrounded by people who say the right things and have the right backgrounds, but who don't actually care about anything beyond their own advancement. You spoke about music with more real feeling in 30 seconds than most of them manage in hours of conversation. Elena remained silent, but Alexander could see her processing his words, weighing them against whatever experiences had made her so cautious about accepting help or opportunities from wealthy strangers. Look, Alexander continued, I know this probably seems strange. It seems strange to me too, honestly. But I have a proposition for you, completely above board and professional. What kind of proposition? I'm hosting a small dinner party tomorrow evening. Nothing like the charity gala, just 8 or 10 people, some business associates, and their spouses. I need someone to oversee the catering and service, someone who understands both the practical requirements and the social dynamics. The pay would be substantially more than your usual rate here. Elena considered this offer carefully. Why not use a professional catering company? Because this particular dinner is important to me, and I want someone I trust to make sure it goes smoothly. Someone who won't be intimidated by the guests and who will maintain the right atmosphere. And you trust me based on one brief conversation? I trust your competence based on watching you work, and I trust your character based on how you handled a difficult social situation with grace and dignity. Elena looked down at her hands, clearly wrestling with some internal debate. When she looked back up, Alexander was struck again by the depth and intelligence in her dark eyes. Mr. Hartwell, can I be completely honest with you about something? Please. I get the feeling that this job offer isn't really about catering a dinner party. I don't know what it is about, but I've learned to be very careful about situations that seem too good to be true. Alexander felt a flash of respect for her perceptiveness. She was absolutely right, of course. His interest in her went far beyond her professional capabilities, though he was still struggling to understand exactly what he was hoping to accomplish. You're right to be cautious. I suppose what I'm really offering is an opportunity to get to know each other better in a professional context that might benefit both of us. If you're not comfortable with that, I completely understand. Elena was quiet for nearly a full minute, and Alexander found himself holding his breath while he waited for her response. What would be expected of me, specifically? Coordinate with my household staff to plan the menu and service. Oversee the actual dinner to ensure everything runs smoothly. Be available to handle any issues that arise. That's it. And the pay? Alexander named a figure that was roughly equivalent to a month of her current salary for a single evening's work. Elena's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly composed herself. That's very generous. It reflects the importance of the event and the level of responsibility I'm asking you to take on. Elena nodded slowly. I'll need to arrange coverage for my shift here. Does that mean you're accepting? It means I'm willing to try this once and see how it goes. But, Mr. Hartwell, I want to be clear about something. I don't know what your expectations are beyond the professional requirements you've outlined, but I'm not interested in being anyone's project or charity case. I've worked hard to build an independent life for myself, and I'm not looking to complicate that. Understood. This is a professional arrangement, nothing more. Even as he said it, Alexander wasn't entirely sure he believed his own words. There was something about Elena Rodriguez that had awakened a curiosity he hadn't felt in years, a desire to understand her story and perhaps become part of it. But he also respected her boundaries and her obvious need to maintain control over her own circumstances. Then, I'll see you tomorrow evening, Elena said. Where should I report, and what time? Alexander's penthouse apartment occupied the entire top floor of a prestigious Manhattan building, offering panoramic views of Central Park and the city skyline. Elena arrived 30 minutes early, as was her habit when taking on any professional responsibility. The building's doorman, clearly accustomed to dealing with wealthy residents and their staff, directed her to the service elevator with polite efficiency. When the elevator doors opened on the penthouse level, Elena stepped into a private foyer that was larger than most people's living rooms. The apartment beyond was a study in understated elegance, with floor-to-ceiling windows, museum-quality artwork, and furniture that managed to be both luxurious and comfortable. Despite its obvious wealth, the space felt more like a home than the sterile showplace she had expected. Alexander's housekeeper, Mrs. Chun, greeted Elena with professional warmth. She was a petite woman in her 60s who had clearly been managing high-end households for decades. Her efficiency was immediately apparent as she led Elena through the apartment, explaining the evening's arrangements with crisp precision. Mr. Hartwell wants this to feel intimate and relaxed, Mrs. Chun explained as they toured the dining room. 8 guests total, seated at the oval table. He specifically requested that you handle all direct guest interaction, while my staff manages the kitchen and service logistics. Elena nodded, making notes on the guest list and dietary requirements Mrs. Chun provided. The names were familiar from business magazines and society pages, but she was pleased to see that none of them had been at the charity gala where she had first encountered Alexander. Has Mr. Hartwell hosted many dinner parties like this? Elena asked as they reviewed the wine selection. Mrs. Chun paused in her explanation, giving Elena a curious look. To be honest, Miss Rodriguez, this is quite unusual for him. Mr. Hartwell typically conducts his business entertaining at restaurants or clubs. He's very private about his personal space, and he rarely invites people here unless they're close friends or family. This information made Elena wonder again about Alexander's true motivations for the evening. If he normally kept his professional and personal lives separate, why was he making an exception now? As if summoned by her thoughts, Alexander appeared in the dining room doorway. He had changed from his usual business attire into dark slacks and a charcoal cashmere sweater that made his gray eyes appear almost silver. The casual elegance suited him, softening the intimidating intensity that seemed to surround him in more formal settings. Elena, thank you for coming early. I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed. His attention shifted to Mrs. Chun. How are the preparations coming along? Everything is on schedule, sir. The first course will be ready to serve at 7:30, as requested. Alexander nodded approvingly, then turned back to Elena. Would you like to see the rest of the apartment? It might help you anticipate any needs that arise during the evening. Elena agreed, though she suspected this tour was more about Alexander's desire to spend time with her than any practical necessity. He led her through the spacious living area, pointing out various amenities and explaining the evening's planned flow of activities. We'll have cocktails in the living room first, then move to the dining room for dinner. Afterward, some guests might want to step out onto the terrace for coffee and digestives. Alexander paused by a pair of French doors that opened onto a wraparound balcony. The view is particularly beautiful at night. As they walked, Elena found herself studying the artwork and personal touches that revealed glimpses of Alexander's personality. There were photographs of him with various political and business figures, but also more intimate shots of family gatherings and travel adventures. One wall featured a collection of vintage musical instruments, including an antique violin and what appeared to be a small harpsichord. "Do you play?" Elena asked, gesturing toward the instruments. Alexander's expression grew thoughtful. "I used to years ago. My grandmother insisted that a proper education included music. I haven't touched any of them since she died." There was something vulnerable in his tone that made Elena want to ask more, but she sensed this was sensitive territory. Instead, she simply nodded and continued the tour. The last stop was Alexander's study, a comfortable room lined with books and dominated by a massive mahogany desk. One wall was entirely devoted to photographs and memorabilia from various charitable endeavors. Elena was surprised by the breadth of his philanthropic involvement, from education initiatives to medical research to disaster relief efforts. "You're involved in quite a lot of causes," she observed, studying a photograph of Alexander distributing supplies in what appeared to be a refugee camp. "Wealth carries responsibilities," Alexander replied simply. "My grandmother always said that privilege without purpose is just self-indulgence." Elena was beginning to understand that his grandmother had been a major influence in his life, shaping both his values and his love of music. She wondered what had happened to cause him to abandon the instruments that clearly held such sentimental significance. They returned to the main living area just as the first guests began to arrive. Elena positioned herself strategically near the entrance, ready to handle coats and introductions while Alexander played host. She watched with professional interest as he greeted each arrival with the perfect balance of warmth and authority that marked him as a natural leader. The guest list was an interesting mix of business leaders, cultural figures, and what appeared to be a few longtime friends. Elena recognized a prominent art dealer, the head of a major investment firm, and a woman who served on the boards of several prestigious cultural institutions. Despite their obvious wealth and influence, the atmosphere remained relaxed and genuinely social rather than stiffly formal. As the cocktail hour progressed, Elena found herself impressed by Alexander's skill as a host. He moved effortlessly between groups, drawing quiet individuals into conversations and moderating discussions before they became too intense or exclusionary. It was clear that this evening was important to him, though she still couldn't determine exactly why. During a brief lull in her duties, Elena retreated to the kitchen to check on the dinner preparations. Mrs. Chun and her staff had everything under perfect control, but Elena wanted to ensure that the timing would work smoothly when it came time to transition from cocktails to dinner. "He's different tonight," Mrs. Chun observed quietly as she supervised the plating of the first course. "Different how?" "More engaged, more present. Usually when he entertains for business, he goes through the motions efficiently, but without much personal investment. Tonight, he seems to actually care about whether people are enjoying themselves." Elena pondered this observation as she returned to the living area. Mrs. Chin's words reinforced her growing sense that this evening was about more than business networking or social obligation. Alexander was clearly making an effort to create something special, though his ultimate purpose remained mysterious. As she moved through the room, refilling drinks and ensuring everyone was comfortable, Elena found herself on the periphery of several fascinating conversations. The art dealer was discussing a recent acquisition of contemporary sculptures, while the investment executive shared insights about emerging markets in Southeast Asia. These were the kinds of discussions she had missed since leaving her former life behind. The intellectual stimulation of being around people who were passionate about their work and knowledgeable about the world. At 7:30 precisely, Elena began the subtle process of encouraging guests to move toward the dining room. Alexander had requested that this transition feel natural rather than abrupt, so she worked carefully to signal that dinner was ready without interrupting ongoing conversations. The dining room conversation flowed as smoothly as the wine, covering topics from international politics to technological innovation to artistic trends. Elena was struck by the depth and breadth of knowledge represented around the table, and she found herself listening intently even as she coordinated with Mrs. Chen's staff to ensure flawless service. Midway through the main course, the conversation turned to education and the challenges facing cultural institutions in securing adequate funding. Alexander listened thoughtfully to various perspectives before offering his own insights. I've been thinking lately about the disconnect between cultural education and real-world access to the arts, he said, glancing briefly in Elena's direction. We spend enormous amounts of money on prestigious institutions that serve a relatively small, already privileged population, while much larger groups of people who might benefit from artistic education and expression have no opportunities at all. A woman named Victoria Sommer, who headed a major arts foundation, nodded enthusiastically. That's exactly what we've been grappling with in our strategic planning. How do we make classical music and fine arts relevant and accessible to broader communities? Maybe the problem is that we're approaching it backwards, suggested David Kim, a tech entrepreneur who had built his fortune developing educational software. Instead of trying to bring people to existing institutions, what if we found ways to bring the arts directly into their communities? Elena found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn into the discussion despite her role as service coordinator. This was precisely the kind of challenge she had hoped to tackle when she first pursued her degree in music education, before circumstances forced her to abandon those dreams. Community integration is crucial, agreed Marcus Thompson, the investment executive. But you also need people with both artistic credentials and real understanding of how to connect with diverse populations. That combination is surprisingly rare. As the conversation continued, Elena became increasingly aware that Alexander was watching her reactions to the various points being raised. She tried to maintain her professional demeanor, but she could feel her passion for these issues showing in her expression despite her best efforts to remain neutral. When Mrs. Chen's staff began clearing the main course, Elena excused herself to oversee the dessert service. In the kitchen, she took a moment to compose herself, reminding herself that she was here as hired help, not as a participant in policy discussions about arts education. Miss Rodriguez. Mrs. Chen approached with a slight frown. Mr. Hartwell asked me to tell you that he'd like you to join the table for dessert and coffee. Elena's surprise must have shown on her face, because Mrs. Chen continued. I know it's unusual, but he was quite specific. He said you should take the empty chair next to Ms. Sommer. This request went far beyond the professional boundaries Elena had expected for the evening. Joining the table as a guest rather than serving staff would fundamentally change her role in the gathering, and she wasn't sure she was prepared for that kind of scrutiny from Alexander's influential friends. Did he say why? Something about wanting to get your perspective on the discussion they've been having. Miss Rodriguez, if you don't mind an old woman's advice, Mr. Hartwell is not someone who makes casual requests. If he's asking you to join his dinner party, there's something important behind it. Elena nodded slowly, recognizing that she had reached another decision point in her increasingly complicated relationship with Alexander Hartwell. She could politely decline and maintain the safe distance she had worked so hard to establish in her new life. Or she could accept his invitation and risk exposing herself to exactly the kind of attention and scrutiny she had been trying to avoid. Taking a deep breath, Elena smoothed her black skirt and checked her reflection in the kitchen's stainless steel surfaces. Whatever Alexander's motives for this invitation, she had agreed to help make his dinner party a success. If that now included participating as a guest rather than serving staff, she would handle it with the same professionalism she brought to all her responsibilities. When she returned to the dining room, Alexander stood and gestured toward the empty chair. Everyone, I'd like you to meet Elena Rodriguez. She's been coordinating this evening's service, but more importantly, she has extensive background in music education, and I thought her perspective might add something valuable to our discussion. The transition felt surprisingly natural, as if Alexander had planned this development from the beginning. Elena found herself seated between Victoria Sommer and David Kim, both of whom welcomed her warmly and seemed genuinely interested in hearing her thoughts. As dessert was served and coffee poured, the conversation resumed with Elena now an active participant rather than an observer. She discovered that her years of practical experience, combined with her academic background, gave her insights that complemented the more theoretical approaches favored by some of Alexander's other guests. The challenge isn't just funding or access, Elena found herself saying in response to a question about community arts programs. It's about understanding that different communities have their own rich musical traditions that deserve respect and integration rather than replacement. Victoria leaned forward with obvious interest. Can you elaborate on that? Well, for instance, many immigrant communities have incredibly sophisticated musical cultures that could serve as bridges to broader artistic appreciation. Instead of starting with the assumption that classical European traditions are the gold standard everyone should aspire to, you could begin with the music that already means something to people and build connections from there. The table fell silent for a moment as everyone processed this perspective. Elena worried briefly that she had overstepped some invisible boundary, but then Marcus Thompson nodded thoughtfully. As Alexander's guests began to take their leave, the atmosphere in the penthouse shifted from the animated energy of dinner conversation to something more intimate and reflective. Elena found herself helping with the subtle logistics of departure, coordinating coat retrievals, and ensuring everyone had transportation arranged. The professional habits of years of service work reasserted themselves automatically, even after the evening's surprising transition from staff member to dinner participant. Victoria Sommer was among the last to leave, and she made a point of seeking out Elena before her departure. "I hope you'll consider reaching out to me," Victoria said, pressing her business card into Elena's hand. "Our foundation is always looking for people who understand both the practical and philosophical challenges of arts education. Your perspective tonight was genuinely refreshing." Elena accepted the card with a mixture of gratitude and trepidation. "Thank you. That's very kind of you to say. I mean it seriously. We need voices like yours in the cultural sector." Victoria glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard, then lowered her voice slightly. "Alexander told me a bit about your background. I understand you might be looking for opportunities to get back into music education professionally." This revelation surprised Elena. Alexander had discussed her background with his guests, presenting her not as hired help but as a professional peer worthy of their consideration. The gesture was both flattering and slightly unsettling, another example of how he seemed determined to blur the careful boundaries she had established around her current life. After the last guest departed, Elena began gathering coffee cups and dessert plates, falling back into service mode as a way to process the evening's unexpected developments. Mrs. Chun and her staff had handled most of the cleanup efficiently, but Elena felt the need to stay busy while she sorted through her complicated feelings about what had just occurred. "Leave that," Alexander said quietly, appearing at her elbow as she stacked dishes. "Mrs. Chin's team will handle the rest." Elena straightened, suddenly, aware that they were alone in the spacious apartment for the first time all evening. The intimacy of the situation felt both natural and dangerous, given the undercurrent of attraction that had been building between them despite her best efforts to maintain professional distance. "The evening was a success," she said, defaulting to safe, professional commentary. "Your guests seemed to genuinely enjoy themselves, and the discussions were substantive without being overwhelming." Alexander nodded, but his attention seemed focused on her rather than her assessment of the dinner party. "You were remarkable tonight. The way you contributed to the conversation, the insights you offered about arts education, it confirmed everything I suspected about your capabilities." Elena felt a flutter of pride at his praise, followed immediately by wariness about where this conversation might be heading. "I enjoyed the discussion. It's been a long time since I've had the opportunity to explore those kinds of ideas with people who share similar interests." "Why?" Alexander's question was direct, cutting through her diplomatic response to the heart of something more personal. "Why has it been a long time? What brought you to New York, working in a job that clearly doesn't utilize your education or abilities?" This was exactly the line of questioning Elena had been hoping to avoid. The evening had already pushed her far beyond her comfort zone in terms of exposure and visibility. Now Alexander was asking directly about the circumstances that had led to her carefully constructed new identity. "Everyone has a story, Mr. Hartwell. Not all of them are particularly interesting or relevant to present circumstances." Alexander studied her face, clearly recognizing her deflection for what it was. "You're right, of course. I apologize if that was too personal. It's just that tonight confirmed my impression that you're exceptional, and I'm curious about how someone exceptional ends up underemployed and seemingly determined to remain invisible." His perceptiveness was both impressive and concerning. Elena had worked hard to perfect the art of blending into the background, of being competent enough to avoid attention while never standing out sufficiently to invite scrutiny. Alexander's interest in her represented exactly the kind of visibility she had been trying to avoid. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation another time," Elena suggested, moving toward where she had left her coat. "It's been a long evening, and I'm sure you have early meetings tomorrow." But Alexander didn't seem ready to let her leave just yet. "Actually, there's something else I wanted to discuss with you. A more substantial opportunity than tonight's catering work." Elena paused, her hand on her coat. Despite her desire to maintain distance, she couldn't help being curious about what he might propose. The evening had reminded her how much she missed being part of meaningful work, the intellectual stimulation of tackling complex challenges with passionate, knowledgeable colleagues. "What kind of opportunity?" "I've been considering establishing a foundation focused on community-based arts education. Tonight's conversation crystallized a lot of ideas I've been developing, and your contributions made me realize I need someone with your combination of academic background and practical insight to help shape the program." Elena turned to face him fully, her professional interest overriding her personal caution. "What would such a foundation look like?" Alexander's enthusiasm was evident as he began outlining his preliminary vision. "Rather than creating another traditional institution, I want to develop a model that brings high-quality arts education directly into underserved communities. Mobile programs, partnerships with community centers and schools, training for local teachers and volunteers. The goal would be to supplement and enhance existing cultural traditions rather than replacing them." The concept was exactly the kind of innovative approach Elena had dreamed about during her graduate studies. It addressed many of the systemic problems she had identified in traditional arts education while respecting the cultural wealth that already existed in diverse communities. "It sounds ambitious," she said carefully. "Also expensive and logistically complex." "Both true, which is why I need someone with real expertise to help develop a practical framework. Someone who understands both the educational theory and the community dynamics involved." Elena recognized that Alexander was offering her the opportunity to be involved in exactly the kind of work she had hoped to pursue before her life took its dramatic turn. It was tempting almost beyond her ability to resist, but accepting would mean stepping fully back into the professional world where her past might eventually catch up with her. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm flattered that you would consider me for such a significant role, but I think you may be overestimating my qualifications based on one evening's conversation." "I don't think I am. Tonight confirmed my initial impression of your capabilities, but it isn't the only basis for my offer. I've done some research into your academic background and your early career work." Elena's heart stopped. "What kind of research?" Alexander's expression became apologetic as he realized the impact of his words. "I hope you won't be offended, but I had my assistant look into your professional history. Your master's thesis on community-based music education was groundbreaking, and the pilot programs you developed in Chicago received national recognition before." He trailed off, clearly realizing he was venturing into territory that might be painful for Elena to discuss. But the damage was done. If he had researched her academic and professional background, he had almost certainly discovered the circumstances that had forced her to abandon her career and flee to New York. "Before what, Mr. Hartwell?" Elena's voice was steady, but Alexander could see the tension in her posture as she prepared herself for whatever he might say next. "Before you left Chicago rather suddenly, 2 years ago, and disappeared from the professional music education community entirely." The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken questions and carefully guarded secrets. Elena stood perfectly still, weighing her options. She could continue deflecting and hope that Alexander would respect her obvious desire for privacy. Or she could take the risk of trusting him with at least part of the truth, gambling that his interest in her work might outweigh any concerns about her past. "Why did you really invite me here tonight?" she asked finally. "Because I recognized something in you that first evening at the charity gala. Intelligence, passion, integrity, qualities that are surprisingly rare in my usual social circle. And because I've been looking for a way to honor my grandmother's memory by supporting the kind of work she believed in." Alexander moved closer, his expression serious and intent. I'm not interested in your past unless it affects your ability to do this work. What I care about is whether you're interested in building something meaningful, something that could make a real difference in people's lives. Elena found herself torn between hope and fear, between the desire to reclaim the professional identity she had loved and the need to protect the safety she had worked so hard to build. Alexander's foundation could represent everything she had dreamed of achieving, but accepting his offer would mean trusting him with secrets that could destroy the carefully constructed life she had built. I need time to think about this, she said finally. Of course. But, Elena, there's something else you should know. She braced herself for whatever revelation might come next. I remember what I said at the charity gala about Mozart. I was being flippant, showing off for people I didn't particularly respect. But I've been thinking about it since that night, and I realize there's something I genuinely want to understand. Alexander walked over to the wall where his grandmother's musical instruments were displayed. He stood there for a moment, studying the antique violin with its worn wood and carefully maintained strings. My grandmother used to say that Mozart's music contained everything necessary to understand the human heart. She believed that anyone who could truly perform his work, who could bring out its emotional depth and complexity, possessed a kind of wisdom that couldn't be taught or bought. Elena watched him carefully, sensing that he was approaching something significant. I stopped playing after she died because the music reminded me too much of her, and I couldn't bear the grief. But lately I've been wondering if I was wrong to abandon something that meant so much to her, something that might help me understand what she was trying to teach me about beauty and meaning and connection. Alexander turned back to face Elena, his gray eyes intense with emotion she hadn't seen him display before. So I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to know that your answer won't affect my offer about the foundation. Those are completely separate matters. Elena nodded, though she suspected that whatever he was about to ask would prove that nothing about their relationship was truly separate or compartmentalized. Do you know any Mozart? Would you sing something for me? The request hit Elena like a physical blow. For 2 years, she had avoided music entirely, unable to bear the memories and associations that came with the art form that had once defined her identity. She had walked away from everything connected to her former life, including the music that had been her greatest passion and her most profound source of joy. But, standing in Alexander's apartment, surrounded by his grandmother's instruments, and the lingering warmth of an evening spent discussing the very work she had once hoped to dedicate her life to, Elena felt the walls she had built around her heart beginning to crack. She started, then stopped, overwhelmed by the complexity of emotions Alexander's simple request had unleashed. Elena spent the next 3 days in turmoil, unable to focus on her regular duties at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel. Alexander's offers hung over her like a storm cloud full of both promise and threat. The foundation work represented everything she had dreamed of achieving professionally, while his personal request about Mozart touched something deeper, a wound she had thought was permanently sealed. On Thursday evening, she found herself walking aimlessly through Central Park, trying to sort through the competing voices in her head. The autumn air was crisp, and the park was largely empty except for a few dedicated joggers and dog walkers. As she passed the bandshell where outdoor concerts were held during warmer months, Elena was struck by a sudden, sharp memory of her former self. 3 years ago, she had been Dr. Elena Rodriguez, assistant professor of music education at Northwestern University, researching innovative approaches to community-based arts programs. She had been passionate, confident, making a name for herself in academic circles with her groundbreaking work on cultural integration in music education. Her future had seemed unlimited, her research was gaining national attention, and she was in love with Dr. James Morrison, a charismatic colleague in the music therapy department. Everything changed the night she discovered that James had been systematically stealing her research, publishing modified versions of her work under his own name while using his established reputation and gender to gain academic credibility she was still building as a young Latina scholar. When she confronted him, he had become violent, threatening not just her career, but her physical safety. The university administration, faced with a choice between protecting a promising young professor and a tenured department store with powerful connections, had chosen to believe James's version of events. Within weeks, Elena had been ostracized by colleagues who accepted James's claims that she was an unstable woman making false accusations out of professional jealousy. Her research funding dried up, her teaching assignments were reduced, and she found herself persona non grata in the academic community she had worked so hard to join. The final blow came when James began using university resources to spread rumors about her mental stability, making it impossible for her to find work at any other institution. Rather than continue fighting a battle she couldn't win, Elena had chosen to disappear entirely. She sold everything she owned, took her grandmother's maiden name of Rodriguez, and moved to New York where she could start over in complete anonymity. For 2 years, she had worked service jobs and avoided anything connected to music or education, telling herself that safety was more important than dreams. Now Alexander Hartwell was offering her the chance to reclaim everything she had lost, but accepting would mean taking the risk that her past might catch up with her. If James discovered that she was working in music education again, he might try to destroy her new life, just as he had destroyed her academic career. Elena was so lost in these painful memories that she almost didn't notice the soft sound of piano music drifting through the evening air. Following the sound, she discovered a street musician playing an old upright piano that someone had apparently donated to the park. He was an elderly black man with weathered hands who was playing classical pieces with remarkable skill and obvious love for the music. As Elena approached, he transitioned into Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 11. The same piece her grandmother had played countless times during Elena's childhood in Barcelona. The familiar melody washed over her like a wave, bringing with it memories of Sunday afternoons spent at her grandmother's piano, learning to sing while the elderly woman played accompaniment with infinite patience and joy. "Beautiful piece," Elena said softly as the man finished the movement. He looked up with a warm smile. "Mozart never gets old, does it? There's something about his music that speaks to every generation. My grandmother used to say that Mozart wrote music for the human soul." Wise woman. "I'm Charles, by the way. Charles Washington. Been playing in this park for about 5 years now, ever since I retired from the New York Philharmonic." Elena's eyes widened. "The Philharmonic? What instrument did you play?" "Piano, primarily, though I could handle most keyboards when needed. Spent 43 years with the orchestra. Now I play here because I missed the connection with people that music is supposed to create." They talked for nearly an hour as Charles continued playing, sharing stories about the power of music to bridge differences and heal wounds. Elena found herself opening up about her love of music education, though she carefully avoided the specifics of her past experience. Charles listened with the attentiveness of someone who understood that music was more than entertainment or career advancement. "You know," Charles said as he played the opening bars of Mozart's Laudate Dominum, "I can tell you have a musical background just from the way you listen. It's different from how most people hear music." "I used to sing," Elena admitted, the words coming out before she could stop them. "Used to? Music doesn't leave you, young lady. It might go quiet for a while, but it never really leaves." As if to prove his point, Charles began playing the aria Elena had known and loved since childhood, the piece her grandmother had taught her to sing in both Latin and Spanish. Without thinking, Elena began to hum along, her voice barely audible even to herself. "There it is," Charles said with satisfaction, never missing a note. "I knew you had music in you." Elena realized with sudden clarity that Charles was right. Despite 2 years of silence, despite all the pain and fear that had driven her away from her former life, the music was still there, waiting for her to find the courage to reclaim it. That night, she called Alexander. "Elena." His voice carried surprise and something that might have been relief. "I was hoping you'd call. I want to discuss your foundation proposal in detail. When would be a good time to meet?" "Tomorrow, if you're available. We could have lunch somewhere quiet where we can talk freely." The next afternoon, Elena found herself in a small, elegant restaurant in the Upper East Side where Alexander had reserved a private dining room. Away from the possibility of being overheard or interrupted, they spent 2 hours discussing his vision for the foundation and how her expertise could help shape its development. Elena was impressed by the depth of Alexander's research and the thoughtfulness of his preliminary plans. He had clearly spent considerable time thinking about the challenges of community-based arts education, and he asked intelligent questions about implementation strategies and potential obstacles. I want to start with a pilot program, Alexander explained as they reviewed his initial budget projections. 3 or 4 communities with different demographics and cultural backgrounds to test various approaches and learn what works best. That's smart, Elena agreed. Each community will have different needs and resources. What you learn in one place might not apply elsewhere without significant modifications. As they discussed the practical details of launching such a program, Elena felt the familiar excitement of working on meaningful projects with someone who shared her passion for the field. This was the kind of collaboration she had dreamed of during her graduate studies, the opportunity to implement innovative ideas with adequate resources and institutional support. There's one more thing we should discuss, Alexander said as they neared the end of their planning session. I want to be completely transparent about my motivations for involving you in this project. Elena braced herself, wondering if he was about to reveal some hidden agenda or inappropriate expectation. I've been looking for a way to honor my grandmother's memory for 5 years now, but I couldn't figure out how to do something that would really capture her spirit and values. When I met you, when I saw your passion for music education and your understanding of how art can bridge cultural divides, I realized you might be the key to creating something she would have been proud of. Alexander paused, his expression becoming more personal and vulnerable. But I also need to acknowledge that my interest in you goes beyond your professional qualifications. I'm attracted to your intelligence, your integrity, your strength in the face of whatever difficulties brought you to New York. If that makes you uncomfortable, or if you think it might interfere with our working relationship, please tell me now. Elena appreciated his honesty, even as it complicated her feelings about their collaboration. I think we can maintain appropriate professional boundaries as long as we're both committed to the foundation's success above any personal considerations. Agreed. The work comes first. Alexander smiled. Does this mean you're accepting my offer? Elena took a deep breath, making the decision that would either restore her professional life or expose her to the dangers she had spent 2 years trying to avoid. Yes, I accept. Alexander's face lit up with genuine joy. Excellent. We'll start with the legal paperwork to establish the foundation, then begin reaching out to potential community partners. I'll want you involved in every aspect of the planning and implementation. As they shook hands to seal their agreement, Elena felt a mixture of excitement and terror. She was about to step back into the world she had fled, but this time she would have resources and support she had never experienced before. There's one more thing, Alexander said as they prepared to leave. About Mozart. Elena had been dreading this moment, knowing that Alexander's request would eventually resurface despite their focus on professional matters. You don't have to answer now, but I want you to know that the invitation stands. Whenever you feel ready, if you ever feel ready. That evening, Elena returned to Central Park and found Charles at his piano. She told him about the foundation, about the opportunity to return to music education work, about the fear and excitement of stepping back into her former professional identity. Sounds like this Alexander fellow sees who you really are, Charles observed as he played gentle improvisations. That's a rare gift, recognizing someone's true self beneath whatever masks they're wearing. I'm terrified that I won't be able to do the work anymore. It's been 2 years since I've been involved in anything related to music education. What if I've lost the ability to connect with students, to design effective programs? Charles stopped playing and looked at her directly. Young lady, let me tell you something I learned in 43 years of professional music. Talent doesn't disappear just because it gets buried for a while. Passion doesn't die just because it gets wounded. You may be rusty, but the essential gifts that made you good at this work are still there. 2 weeks later, the Elena Rodriguez Foundation for Community Arts Education was officially established, with Elena serving as its first executive director. Alexander had insisted on naming the foundation after her, over her protests that she preferred to maintain a lower profile. He argued that her name on the organization would give it credibility with the academic and cultural communities they needed to engage. Elena threw herself into the foundation work with an energy and dedication that reminded her why she had fallen in love with music education in the first place. She spent her days visiting potential community partners, developing curriculum frameworks, and interviewing candidates for teaching positions. For the first time in 2 years, she felt like herself again, professionally fulfilled and intellectually challenged. 3 months into the foundation's development, Elena and Alexander were working late in the foundation's temporary offices, reviewing applications from communities interested in hosting pilot programs. The work was demanding but exhilarating, requiring all of Elena's academic expertise and practical experience. "I think we should include the community center in Queens," Elena said, spreading demographic charts across Alexander's desk. "Their population includes recent immigrants from 6 different countries, which would give us valuable insight into multicultural programming approaches." Alexander nodded, making notes on his copy of the application. "What about staffing? Do they have adequate facilities for the kind of programming we're proposing?" As they discussed logistical details, Elena found herself marveling at how natural their collaboration had become. Alexander respected her expertise completely, deferring to her judgment on educational matters while providing strategic guidance on administrative and financial issues. Their professional partnership worked seamlessly, though Elena remained carefully aware of the personal undercurrents that occasionally surfaced in their interactions. "Elena," Alexander said suddenly, breaking off from their discussion of budget allocations. "There's something I want to show you." He led her to a corner of the office where he had installed one of his grandmother's instruments, the small harpsichord she had seen in his apartment. Elena had watched him bring it in several weeks ago, but had never asked about his reasoning. "I thought it belonged here," Alexander explained. "She would have loved this foundation, loved the work we're doing. Having her harpsichord here makes it feel like she's part of the project." Elena ran her fingers gently over the instrument's polished wood surface. "It's beautiful. Do you ever play it?" "Not since she died. I've been afraid that I wouldn't be able to bear the memories." Elena understood that fear intimately. For 2 years, she had avoided music entirely for similar reasons, terrified that engaging with the art form she loved would bring back painful associations with everything she had lost. "Maybe," she said quietly, "it's time for both of us to stop being afraid." Alexander looked at her with surprise and hope. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering directly, Elena moved to the harpsichord's bench and lifted the instrument's lid. The keys were perfectly maintained, their ivory surfaces smooth under her fingertips. She played a few experimental notes, testing the harpsichord's tuning and touch. Then, without allowing herself time to reconsider, Elena began playing the opening measures of Mozart's Laudate Dominum, the piece Charles had introduced her to in Central Park. Her voice, unused for 2 years, began soft and uncertain but gained strength and clarity as the familiar melody awakened memories of joy rather than pain. "Laudate Dominum omnes gentes, laudate eum omnes populi." The Latin words flowed from her memory as naturally as breathing. Elena's voice filled the office space with warmth and beauty that seemed to transform the functional workspace into something sacred and transcendent. As she sang, she felt 2 years of silence and fear beginning to dissolve, replaced by the pure joy she had always found in making music. When the aria ended, Alexander stood frozen in wonder, tears streaming down his face. Elena's performance had been everything his grandmother had described and more, technically flawless but infused with emotional depth that spoke directly to the heart. Alexander struggled to find words adequate to describe what he had just experienced. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Elena looked up at him from the harpsichord bench, her own eyes bright with tears. "Your grandmother was right about Mozart. His music does contain everything necessary to understand the human heart." Alexander moved closer, his usual composure completely abandoned in the face of the profound emotional experience Elena's singing had created. "Elena, I meant what I said at the charity gala. If you sing Mozart like that, I'll marry you." For a moment, the office was completely silent except for the lingering resonance of the harpsichord strings. Elena studied Alexander's face, seeing not the casual arrogance that had motivated his original challenge, but genuine love and admiration. "Alexander," she said softly, "you should know that I'm not the person you think I am. My real story, my past, it's complicated and potentially dangerous. If you really want to be part of my life, you need to understand what you're getting into. Alexander sat down beside her on the harpsichord bench, taking her hands in his. Whatever happened before doesn't matter. What matters is who you are now, the work we're doing together, and the fact that I've never met anyone who challenges and inspires me the way you do. Over the next hour, Elena told Alexander everything about her academic career, about James Morrison's betrayal and violence, about the professional destruction that had forced her to abandon her identity and flee to New York. Alexander listened without judgment, his anger growing not at Elena but at the system that had failed to protect her and the man who had stolen her work and threatened her safety. "We'll protect you," Alexander said firmly when Elena finished her story. "Whatever legal or professional support you need to reclaim your academic recognition, whatever security measures are necessary to ensure your safety, we'll make it happen." "Alexander, you don't understand. James has powerful connections throughout the academic music community. If he discovers I'm working in the field again, then we'll be ready for him. Elena, you have something now that you didn't have before: resources, support, and people who believe in you. You don't have to hide anymore." 6 months later, the Elena Rodriguez Foundation for Community Arts Education was featured on the cover of Arts Education Quarterly, with a lengthy article detailing its innovative approaches to multicultural programming. Elena's photograph accompanied the article, marking her return to public professional life after 2 years of anonymity. The article caught James Morrison's attention immediately. Within days of its publication, he began making inquiries about Elena's whereabouts and her connection to the foundation. But this time, Elena wasn't alone and vulnerable. Alexander had hired a team of private investigators who documented James's pattern of harassment and stalking behavior, while prominent lawyers prepared cease and desist orders to protect Elena from any attempts at professional sabotage. More importantly, Elena had built a network of support within the arts education community that recognized her genuine contributions and respected her expertise. Victoria Summers Foundation became a major funding partner, while Charles Washington served as an artistic consultant and mentor for the foundation's music programs. On a crisp October evening, exactly 1 year after they had first met at the charity gala, Elena and Alexander stood together on the stage of Lincoln Center's Alice Tully Hall. The foundation was hosting its first annual benefit concert, featuring performances by students from all 4 of their pilot programs, as well as established artists who supported their mission. As the evening's final performer, Elena had agreed to sing the Mozart aria that had become symbolic of her personal and professional resurrection. Alexander's grandmother's harpsichord had been brought to the stage for the occasion, played by Charles Washington in a collaboration that bridged generations and musical traditions. "Before I sing," Elena told the packed auditorium, "I want to thank someone who taught me that music truly belongs to everyone, and that courage isn't the absence of fear but the decision to pursue what matters despite being afraid." She looked directly at Alexander, who was, "You don't have to answer now," Alexander said gently. "But if you ever feel ready, I'd be honored to hear you sing." "And Elena, whatever brought you to New York, whatever you're running from or trying to forget, you don't have to carry it alone anymore. Not if you don't want to." His words were offered without conditions or expectations, a simple acknowledgement that he saw her struggle and was willing to help bear whatever burden she carried. It was the kind of kindness Elena hadn't allowed herself to hope for in 2 years of careful isolation. As she gathered her coat and prepared to leave, Elena realized that Alexander Hartwell had somehow managed to see through all her careful defenses to the person she used to be, the person she was afraid she might never be again. His foundation offered her the chance to reclaim her professional identity, while his personal interest offered something even more precious: the possibility that she might not have to remain hidden forever. But accepting either offer would require her to trust someone with the truth about why she had abandoned everything she loved and fled to a new city with nothing but a false sense of safety and a voice she was too afraid to use. That's a completely different paradigm than most cultural institutions operate from. It requires humility about what constitutes valuable art. Exactly, Elena continued, gaining confidence. And it requires teachers and administrators who can function as cultural translators, people who understand both the technical aspects of music and the social dynamics of diverse communities. As the evening progressed, Elena found herself increasingly engaged in the stimulating discussion. These were the kinds of conversations she had dreamed of having when she first decided to pursue music education. The opportunity to explore how art could serve as a force for connection and understanding rather than exclusion and elitism. She was so absorbed in the intellectual exchange that she almost forgot about the unusual circumstances that had brought her to this table. For a few hours, she was simply Elena Rodriguez, music educator and passionate advocate for arts accessibility, rather than Elena the waitress hiding from her past. It wasn't until the evening began winding down that she remembered the complex web of deception and half-truths that defined her current life, and the fact that she was sitting at the table of a man whose casual challenge about Mozart had unknowingly struck at the heart of everything she had lost, and everything she was afraid to reclaim. Alexander gave her his address and the relevant details. Watching as she made careful notes on a small pad she pulled from her pocket. Her thoroughness and attention to detail reinforced his growing conviction that she was far more than she appeared to be on the surface. As they parted ways, Alexander found himself looking forward to the dinner party with an anticipation he hadn't felt about a social gathering in years. For the first time, he would be hosting an event where he genuinely cared about the outcome, not just because of its potential business implications, but because it would give him another opportunity to observe the fascinating woman who had somehow managed to capture his imagination so completely. Elena watched him walk away, then stood in the hotel lobby for several more minutes, trying to process what had just happened. She had spent 2 years carefully building a quiet, unremarkable life, avoiding exactly the kind of attention that Alexander Hartwell represented. Now, despite all her caution and hard-learned wisdom, she had agreed to step directly into the spotlight of his interest. She told herself it was just a job, a chance to earn enough money to finally start building toward her real goals. But, deep down, she knew that wasn't the whole truth. There was something about Alexander that intrigued her as much as she apparently intrigued him, something that made her willing to take risks she had sworn to avoid. Glimpse of something deeper, a passion that she was working hard to keep hidden. "I should really get back to my duties," she said, deflecting the question with practiced ease. "Of course. Thank you for the conversation, Elena." As she moved away, Alexander found himself more intrigued than he had been in months. There was clearly more to Elena Rodriguez than met the eye, and her brief but thoughtful responses had revealed more genuine insight than hours of conversation with his supposed social peers. The remainder of the dinner passed in a blur of predictable speeches about charitable giving and community responsibility. Alexander went through the motions of socializing, writing checks for various causes, and making small talk with the parade of people who approached his table. But his attention kept drifting to Elena as she worked her way efficiently through the dining room, a figure of quiet competence in a world of artificial glamour. When the evening finally began to wind down, Alexander found himself reluctant to leave. His casual challenge about Mozart seemed like a distant memory now, overshadowed by his brief but memorable encounter with the mysterious waitress. As he prepared to collect his coat and driver, he wondered if he would ever see Elena Rodriguez again, and whether she might hold the key to something he hadn't even realized he was searching for.